In this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to make what I like to call the kitchen cupboard barley wine bochet. And yes, I acknowledge that's kind of a long title. For this recipe, you're going to need 3.3 cups of roasted pearl barley. You can find this typically in the tea section at your Asian market. 3.3 cups of toasted oats. I used Quaker oats. 6.6 pounds of caramelized honey. 3.3 pounds of raw honey, 1.6 cups of frozen grape juice concentrate, and 0.8 cups of frozen grape juice concentrate reserved for priming. For our hops, we are going to use 2 ounces of Centennial hops pellets, and of course we'll need spring water to 5 gallons. For our yeast, we will be using EC1118 and fining with gelatin. First things first, we've got to roast our grains. As you can see here, I have 2 baking sheets. We're going to place the oats on one and the barley on another because they will need to roast at just slightly different times. So we want to control the roast for both of these. We'll want to spread these out into a nice thin layer, and we're going to be stirring pretty regularly throughout the toasting process. For this, I had the oven set on about 350 to 400. Changing it here and there as I was trying to get the toast dialed in. And the beverage for this brew day was a lemon wine called Skeeter Pea. This was made with the lees at the bottom of a Merlot and a bunch of lemon juice and water and sugar. It's a nice, airy springtime drink, and it takes on a beautiful sort of pink lemonade color. Like I mentioned, we'll stir intermittently while we are toasting those grains. Try to make sure we don't get any burning on the edges. As I've made this recipe more and more, I've started to roast these on parchment paper because it helps kind of jostle them around. But the parchment paper isn't 100% necessary if you just make sure you stir frequently. And you can really see here the difference between the raw and toasted grains. We are going to now mash up some Campden tablets, 1 per gallon, and place that into a bucket. I'm currently working on a hot mash version of this recipe. This one does a cold mash, so you're going to need a little bit of room in your refrigerator. Grains go in the bucket, and then cover that with spring water. The Campden tablets in here will just kind of work to prevent any little buggies from taking hold while we cold soak these. I used my deep freeze for this instead of my refrigerator, just basically bringing it close to the freezing point and taking it out. Well, do that for about 4 days. Just trying to keep it very, very cold. Here's an overview of all of our other ingredients. After that 4-day waiting period, you will have some nice grain tea. Make sure to stir that up before we strain it off. And brew days really are better with a friend, but often I find myself with the time to do this in my kitchen on my own, and you just kind of figure out a way to make it work. So here we're straining out all of the solids that can be used for baking dog treats or making cookies or bread. And then we're going to pour off a portion. We're trying to split that in half between the 2 buckets because part of this is going to head over to the stove. You're going to take your 2 ounces of hops pellets and split that into thirds. 1/3 goes directly into the bucket, the cold bucket, and those other 2/3 are going to be used in the boil. Also going in the bucket is the grape juice concentrate. Remember, you're going to need to reserve some of that back for priming. And then our 3.3 pounds of raw honey goes into the bucket as well. It is very helpful to have a hand scale to weigh your honey on the spot. Now we start a flame under our cast iron Dutch oven, and into that is going to go a portion of our grain tea. Bring that up to a boil, and add 1/3 of your hops pellets. After 15 minutes, add the remaining third of your hops pellets, And you're going to let this cool for 5 minutes and then strain it out into your bucket. Discard those solids. And now we are going to caramelize our honey. This honey needs to caramelize for about an hour. What you're looking for is a nice dark amber color. It's helpful to keep a plate nearby and use a chopstick to dab out samples of your honey. This fun time lapse here will show you how that color changes over time. Your goal though is to keep that honey moving, because if at any time you let it sit for too long, it will burn on the bottom of your pan and it will basically ruin the whole batch. So you really want to keep it moving, keep it from sticking to the sides, and get it nice and dark. Like I said, this took about an hour. I have caramelized honey up to 90 minutes and avoided burning. So that last remainder of your grain tea is going to very carefully go into that brew kettle, and this will pop and crack, just like you may have seen in our oyster stout video. But just keep on pouring, because the last thing we want is that honey to seize up in the brew kettle. And adding the water at this point will prevent that. It will liquefy the whole batch. Stir, stir, stir. And then back to our brew bucket. And in goes our honey mixture. We're going to top that up to 5 gallons. And then we're going to add 1 Campden tablet per gallon and let this sit for 24 hours. I did this out of an abundance of caution because that grain tea had sat for a few days, even though cold, and I wanted to make sure that no little buggies got into this batch. This step could be avoided, but it's got to come down to room temperature anyway. Sometimes that can take a while, so I figure why not throw in the Campden tablets and wait 24 hours for those tablets to do their thing and gas out. So like I said, we're going to use EC1118 to cut through all the sugars in here. At this time I took our hydrometer reading. It was about 1.080. And added our yeast. This takes about 3 to 4 weeks to ferment and then another few weeks to clear up. And partway through, we're going to add some diammonium phosphate after just a few days to give those yeasts a little bit of added nutrient. They don't need much though. I decided to add maltodextrin at this point. I know this wasn't in the initial ingredients list, but I tested a sample and it needed a little bit more heft in the mouthfeel, and maltodextrin can provide that. So I am experimenting here with 4 ounces. In later revisions of this recipe, I've also experimented with double this amount of maltodextrin and adding lactose. And I will have some of those recipes out eventually so you can brew those and compare. So you're just adding the maltodextrin to a little bit of water, bringing it up to a simmer. And once it's hit simmer, allow that to cool a little bit so you don't shock your glass carboy, and then pour that right into the carboy. And we're going to be racking on top of this, and that whirlpool action inside the carboy will help mix this throughout the batch and make it homogeneous. So start our siphon and siphon that off into the carboy. And while that's going, we will microwave some water and mix that with a little bit of gelatin. There's about a tablespoon of gelatin. And pour that in, and that will act as our fining agent, helping to bond to some of those cold brew protein artifacts that are still left in there from not doing a hot mash, and helps drop some of that sediment to the bottom, giving us a clearer product. A few weeks later, this is clear. I decided to add just a couple of grams of yeast to this to help bolster the yeast in the batch, because I wanted to make sure that this carbonated out well. So I put 2 grams of yeast into some warm water and just let that rehydrate. We're also going to be adding a little bit of the grape juice concentrate. That will provide the fermentable sugars for the yeast so that this can become carbonated in the bottle. Top goes off, grape juice goes in, start our siphon, and yeast goes in. We're racking that off into the bottling bucket, and then we will bottle from there with our bottling wand. This made just over 50 bottles, and as you can see, I have a tendency to recycle bottles, so I've got a lot of mismatched bottles in this batch. And this is possibly the last time that you'll see my bench capper for my birthday, and I got me a hand capper, and it seems to seal my bottles a lot better. This capper is just kind of old and worn out, and it's time to retire it. And here is the obligatory pour shot. Look at that beautiful color. This is one of my favorite things that I brew. I have brewed several batches of it, and like I said, I'm working on a hot mash version of it. I've changed around some of the ingredient quantities, but this version here is pretty damn good, and I would encourage you to brew it if you've got the ability to do so. Most of the ingredients in here can be found in your kitchen cupboard, or could be in your kitchen cupboard. And even though this is a mead, or possibly technically a braggot, it does have a lot of those nice toasty malty flavors of a nice English barley wine. And it's really phenomenal. And I think if you've never had a barley wine before, this might be a great introduction to that world of flavors. But you might brew this up and try it alongside some store-bought barley wines and see what you think. And as always, you can follow us on Instagram and Pinterest, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Hit that bell icon if you want to see when we have new videos out. And if you're looking for recipes or more information or contact info, hit up our website, doingthemost.org.